If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall be unravelling the mysteries behind the Thaumaturgy Paths and Rituals, the powerful blood magic performed by Cainites. This episode's topic was requested by a listener of the Lore by Night podcast. Good, you're here. Do come in and be seated. I have a question to ask. Who have you told about the location of my haven? I have no problem with you bringing in members of your extended coterie into my bar, draining my supply of blood wine and vitae lager as if Gehenna is tomorrow, but I somewhat object to you inviting kindred into my home. You're lucky that they had an interesting question to ask and remarkably interesting to talk with. Far more than you are in any case. The neonate in question was a Violet Ellison of Clan Tremere, who claims to be a founder of Technomancy and creator of a many high-quality journal. She questioned my understanding of it, Technomancy I mean, not her vampiric journals. Honestly, I knew very little of the path, but it was a very wonderful chance to be an educatee rather than educator for a change. If she is not a creator of the path, she is most certainly someone well versed with it. Technomancy is one of the many paths found within the discipline of Thaumaturgy, the hermetic blood sorcery of the Tremere clan, and arguably one of the most versatile disciplines depending on who you ask. Ah yes, I forget that you are of that generation. The hopeless neonates of the 21st century that have bastardized all blood magics, stripping the discipline down to its overpowered bone. The same generation who have smashed obtenebration and necromancy into the remarkably vague term oblivion for reasons unknown to me at this time, but I digress. You seem awfully confused by all of this. I would apologize, but I have mentioned the various paths frequently enough to you to have a passing understanding of what I'm waffling about, so if anyone has to apologize here, it is you, neonate. Well, perhaps tonight's the night we address this. Now, I may not be one of the Broken Clan or an asinine vizier, but I have studied with enough of them to possess great knowledge of many forms of blood magic, so let me pass some of this knowledge to you, child. I suppose we should begin by answering the question of what is blood sorcery. It refers to the strangely unique magic performed by kindred, which is stoked by either religious or occult practices, combined with the power of the vitae of kindred. For the longest time, there were many forms of blood sorcery. You have heard of Thaumaturgy, the most famous example of blood sorcery, the jealously hoarded talent of the Tremere. There is also necromancy, which allows one to manipulate the dead both in body and spirit, depending on which member of Clan Hecate you're dealing with. On the surface, through that description alone, one might assume that the blood sorcery was no different from any other discipline. However, it is nothing like a traditional discipline. You see, many forms of blood sorcery, such as Thaumaturgy, necromancy, and the Cappadocians' mortis before them, requires a tutor to further along one's understanding of the discipline and accompanying rituals, which I will elaborate on shortly. With those three examples in particular, each practitioner chooses a primary path that is taught by the sire, although it is not terribly common for some to learn under many tutors. Only with an intermediate understanding of the path can the kindred progress onto a new one. Any paths after the primary path are not greater in power to that of the primary path for obvious reasons. Necromancers and thaumaturges alike unlock the ability to perform rituals, up to and including the level the user holds in the discipline. Rituals are meticulous formulas. They are carefully researched and prepared with the intention of creating powerful effects of great magical nature. Whilst less versatile than paths, the effects are both straightforward and singular, best suited for specific purposes. The Tremere have a variety of uses for them. They can create wards to prevent unwanted guests, being kindred, ghoul, or lupine, to enter a location, learn the language of an individual by eating their eyes and tongue, creating bloodstones that act as a vampiric GPS, mute individuals who cross the ritual, allowing the cast to do what they please with no fear of the victim speaking ill of them, and much, much more. Although there is one particularly powerful ritual I'm aware of that allows the caster to travel from location to location. There are many rituals that do all sorts of things, so to list them all here would be a laborious use of time. Of course, many of the ritual examples I have given you are practiced by the most modern of Tremere. Necromantic rituals have a totally different function and origins, as the necromancer can either learn their rituals from other Cainites or ghosts. Whilst I could break those down for you now, I feel that necromancy will take us a night of its own to discuss fairly, as it is much older and more interesting in my totally biased opinion. You seem quite surprised by this. Remember that the Tremere are a relatively young clan who ate their way into their position of power. Their thaumaturgy is not the first form of blood magic and has spent some 900 years to mature and develop it like a cheese or wine. Many forms of blood sorcery have come before it, each one putting their own twist on how the Vitae can fuck with the opposition. Sadhana is blood magic that predates the Tremere sorcery by thousands of years, and is practiced primarily by the followers of Set and Dunava. I won't mock you for not knowing this bloodline, for they are not terribly well known and I have only mentioned them once to you. They are an Indian Ventru bloodline that I may discuss with you on another night. Sadhana functions very similarly to vanilla thaumaturgy, but has a very different practice to fully appreciate the discipline. One must engage in long meditation and grueling self-discipline, such as fasting to the point of reaching torpor to unlock the power of their blood. Some of its paths are similar, if not identical, to regular thaumaturgy, but use different names. For example, movement of the mind becomes Rishi's hand, whilst spirit manipulation is referred to as Asura Raja. A form of blood sorcery older still is Assamite sorcery, the origins of which can be sourced back to the Second City, which you may remember regarding our conversation about the Banu Hakim. The sorcery is practiced mainly by the Assamite viziers and scholars, or sorcerers depending on who you ask, but it is also practiced by the Shango, a kindred of the Ebony Kingdom, or Liabon to use the correct title. On a related note, it would be best if you called the sorcery by its proper name, Doran-Ki, which I believe means Master of Heaven and Earth. Doran-Ki draws upon astrology, amulets, and talismans to aid their practices. These usually cause the caster to enter a trance, an ascending sensation I am told that is called the Ladder of Heaven, to meet even more powerful spirits and gain equally powerful magic. Its original application was to defeat the Bali, many of which practiced dark thaumaturgy, which is defined as sorcery taught by demons. As such, this is an unashamedly violently evil discipline. Not even the Sabbat allows its members to practice it, although some naturally slip through the cracks. With the requirement of calling out the names of demons you're communing with, the caster speaks infernal blessings that corrupt the soul every single time the power is used. Oh, and just that we're clear, Neonate, I will not have any infernalist in my domain. I will kill you if I suspect anything of the sort. And let us not forget the Assamites' unique discipline, Quietus, which allows the Banu Hakim to turn the Vitae in a dangerous weapon against their foes. And perhaps older still than any of these sorceries is Aku, one of the many ancient Setite sorceries, birthed from ancient Egypt. The Setite sorceries are a curious phenomenon that is far more ritualistic than any other magic mentioned thus far. The Setites wish to be free from the chains of their former mortal bodies to become as their antediluvian Set was, a god. Their paths are the only one, the true way, as it were. Whilst Aku and Sadhana focuses on Indian and Egyptian cultures respectively, the Setites of the New World, mostly the Serpents of the Light, practice Wanga, a voodoo-inspired blood magic that blurs the lines between rituals and paths. To perform its paths, it often requires the presence of a specific material and speak the names of great power, in addition to using specific tools to meet the ends of the caster. As you may have suspected, Wanga is said to have originated from the Samadhi. Other blood sorceries would develop during our Dark Ages, which are just as bizarrely dangerous to behold, some more so than others. I will let you decide which ones are which. Montano, the favoured child of the antediluvian of Clan La Sombra, was said to be the first to dabble with the source behind obtenebration. Now, most keepers use it as a tool and nothing more, but some pursue the dark secrets of abyss mysticism. Devoting to and indeed obtenebration, it stems from destroys any sense of humanity you have, making it only compatible with those who follow the path of the night and the road of the abyss that came before it. You won't last long if you stick to the road of humanitas. Think about it. When you study the darkness, and I mean a true darkness. Not like the darkness you have at night, or if you were to shut your eyes, but something far more darker, sinister, cold, and unforgiving. You beckon to hear the voices from within another dark world, seeking creatures to control and manipulate, turning the one vampiric safety net against yourselves and others. How can you pretend to be human after all of that? You can't. Just as bizarre and frightening is Coldtonic Sorcery, which is practiced mainly by the old clan Zamitsi through their connection with the demon Kupala they are spiritually bound to. Whilst it is considered a blood magic in principle, Coldtonic Sorcery is very different in practice. The Coldon would call upon the service of spirits of nature rather than memorized rites and rituals. It tends to be much more subtle than the Tremere's thaumaturgy at lower levels, whilst Coldonism requires not so much an extension of will as a being a master of the very material a fiend wishes to manipulate, be it earth, wind, or fire. I see that you remember us discussing those two before when we spoke of the La Sombre and Zamitsi a few months ago, so you're not totally brainless after all, but have you ever heard of a variant of Coldtonic Sorcery called Argum? I doubt it, because it is performed by a gangrel bloodline that is either extinct or in total isolation. They are the Lianen, who use this discipline alongside Celtic runes and a mortal sacrifice to tap into a spirit's power buried within each druid to inflict curses, manipulate the natural world, and buff themselves to be stronger. Argum is a natural discipline for the Lianen, unlike Coldtonic Sorcery for the old clan Zamitsi. Argum is a limited form of blood magic. It is neither as flexible nor as powerful as any other blood sorcery, but it can be just as, if not more so powerful within the Lianen's territory. The further away the Lianen is from their haven, the discipline's potency is weakened. Some would argue it is about 50 miles before the potency is noticed, or rather, the lack of thereof, whilst others say it is a mile before the discipline weakens, but I suppose it depends on who you ask and the Lianen in question. The final blood sorcery that birthed around this time was of course the thaumaturgy of Clan Tremere, that incredibly versatile discipline they have invested most if not all of their time into like some macabre science experiment, for that is exactly what it is. Thaumaturgy birthed when the Tremere realised their mortal magic did not carry over into their new vampiric unlives and knew they would be hopeless without it. Whilst I stated earlier that it is one of the more versatile disciplines, it is not as versatile as the magic that came before it, which is only limited by one's imagination. I was told that during the first 100 years of the clan's existence, there were 4 lesser paths and 3 greater paths, the former being taught to the warlocks first before they pursued the greater paths. The lesser paths, Creatio Ignis, Iter Pernix, Potestas Motus, and Potestas Tempestarum, were individual powers that allowed the cast to create fire, instill determination to animals, mortals, and vampires to move quickly, wield telekinesis, and influence the weather respectively. Furthering along the path strengthened the path. The greater paths, Potestas Elementorum, Potestas Extragrabilius, and Potestas Vitae, were similar to regular paths and disciplines in that you would learn something new as you further educated yourself in the arts of manipulating the elements, the speech and thoughts of others, or stealing blood from a distance respectively. As time would pass, so too would the Tremere's understanding in their stolen Cainite powers, granting them many opportunities and creatively sinister ways for the warlocks to screw with the opposition. In these modern nights, there are a variety of different paths and rituals for the warlock to master. They can all be countered with 2 because of course the warlocks has a safety word, 2 actually, thaumaturgical countermagic. Unlike the following paths, this is the only path treated as a separate discipline and can be taught to any magical inept idiots such as yourself. From what I have observed, most modern Tremere neonates are typically taught the path of Bloodthirst, which focuses on the direct manipulation, theft, or even boiling the vitae of kindred, whether it is themselves or those that oppose the thaumaturge. This was previously known as Potestas Vitae. Potestas Elementorium, however, is now called Elemental Mastery, allowing the caster limited control over the environment around them, with some of the more advanced powers allowing them to summon an elemental, which have been known to attack the summoner. Elemental Mastery does not involve plant matter, however, but the green path does, be it the smallest daisy to the tallest of oak trees. On the opposite end of that lively path is Hands of Destruction, most common within the Sabbat. Many Camarilla Tremere do not pursue this path for it allegedly has demonic origins. Similarly, the Path of Corruption, which was probably developed from Potestas Exgrobilius, influences the mentality of victims. It cannot give direct orders like dominate or change the emotional well-being like presence can. Instead, it feeds and creates dark thoughts that influence the mental and emotional well-being of the person, which is far more debilitating than those two disciplines combined in my small opinion. Yes, the Tremere can still manipulate the weather by studying weather control or potestas tempestium. Creatio ignis is now referred to as the law of flames, which allows the Tremere to create and propel fireballs of various sizes, depending on the caster's understanding of the path. Yes, these can cause other kindred to frenzy and they hurt like a bitch. Path of the Levin Bolt allows the caster to shoot lightning instead. Movement of the mind, previously Potestas Motus, does exactly what it says, which I'm sure doesn't require any further explanation. Another Sabbat and occasionally Anarch-centered path is the Path of Mars, which is for stirring allies into battle, which is where it gets its namesake from. You know, Mars being the bringer of war. Some Camarilla Tremere do possess this discipline, but with my experience they just lack the gumption to use it properly, for they're far more sheltered than those outside of the pyramid. The inverse of this would arguably be the Path of the Focused Mind, which focuses the mind of the individual, just as the title would subtly imply. An older and rarer path called Mastery of the Mortal Shell was conjured, to pardon the pun, to halt the Gangrel and Zamitsi who were attacking their chantries, literally, by seizing up bones and muscle, even controlling the victim like marionettes. Similarly, the Path of Spirit Manipulation allows the caster to control spirits, which are manifestations of the energies of the universe, and not the wraiths one may control with necromancy. Allegedly. The Path of the Father's Vengeance is only practiced by the Sabbat, simply because it combines the magical properties of the Cainites Vitae and scriptures from the Book of Nod. Naturally, this path is the most interesting to me. It can reverse the powers gained from diablerie, creating powerful lights to harm kindred and even prevent the vampire to drink blood. Yes, this path only works against other vampires. Neptune's Might is about waterbending, to imprison, transfiguration, or drain the victim of water, which is even more frightening when you remember that 60% of our bodies is comprised of the other vital liquid. Conjuration of the Mind allows the Tremere to summon generic and believable objects out of thin air. Literally, this can include replicated life. The most recent path under the Thaumaturgy tree is the Path of Technomancy, the path that Tremere Violet Ellison questioned me about recently. She explained to me that it was developed during the latter half of the 20th century and was designed to manipulate technology. Whilst there is no doubt denying wizard hackers could easily exceed the talents of any ordinary geek, many Camarilla Tremere, especially those in Europe, deem the blending of mortal stimuli and old magic to be blasphemous, despite the path receiving approval by the inner circle. This divisive opinion was one of the many reasons for Miss Ellison to join the Anarch movement, which is a little bit frustrating and rather disappointing. I had high hopes for her, but I do know that no one is perfect. Shame. What a pity. Oh yes, we were talking about Thaumaturgy, and you look quite confused yet again tonight, Neonate. Have you forgotten that more and more Tremere are joining the Anarch sect in these modern nights? I would say that I am disappointed, but I honestly do not have the energy to expel it right now. Naturally, Tremere have brought their magics with them, which is creatively called Anarch Sorcery, a hodgepodge of various paths and clans they call waves that are no longer limited to just Tremere among the riffraff of the sect. The first of these waves is the old School Sorcery, and that is school with a K to make it edgier, I think? Anyway, these anarchs could practice magics that exist before those performed by mages ranging from paganism, Wicca, voodoo, and Native American shamanism. They do not treat their paths just as a source of power, but a lifestyle choice, which means that the conflicting spiritualities are often at each other's throats. Their relationship with magic is for the most part more liberating and enlightening as a result. All clans can join, and the Thaumaturgy paths they follow are Elemental Mastery, the Green Path, Path of Mars, Weather Control, Path of the Evil Eye, which I believe is a Duan Key path, Spirit Manipulation, and Voodoo Necromancy, which you may know as Wanga, which I described to you earlier on this evening. New Age blood magic has a somewhat more modernized belief, which began in the 1970s. This wave attempts to integrate Eastern and Western spirituality, influenced by elements of parapsychology and pop science. Whilst all clans are able to fit nicely, it draws mostly Malkavians and Toreadors like moths to a flame. There are also plenty of Bruja and Gangrel who wish to find an alternative to subdue the beast for a little longer. The common paths found within New Age blood magic are the Green Path, Law of Flames, Movement of the Mind, the Path of Blood, Path of Corruption, and Path of the Focused Mind. You could also find users who use the Path of Teleportation, which allows one to literally teleport from one location to the other. There is a Sadhana variant known as the Path of Prepaptry, and some also refer to it as the Path of Mercury. As disorganized the Anarchs are, the previous waves are fairly organized, well, within reason. The same cannot be said with the punk sorcery wave. As a result, it is often the most misunderstood. You see, it was birthed from the music and subcultures of the same name, punk, that exploded onto the UK during the mid to late 1970s. It can be summed up by the corporist and destructive efforts of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher of the US and UK respectively, and the sorcery reflects this. The magic performed here seeks to tear down society, replacing it with a new, scripted anarchy, altering the state of consciousness rather than repeating the same rituals mindlessly over and over again. And the common paths you can find with punk sorcery are Hands of Destruction, Law of Flames, Path of Blood, Path of the Evil Eye, Path of Mars, Path of the Levenbolt, and Voodoo Necromancy. Finally, you have the most recent of Anarch thaumaturgical waves, Hacktivist Thaumaturgy, which began with a Tremere coterie in Washington, D.C. in the early 21st century, so perhaps Miss Violet was one of Technomancy's founders after all. Anyway, these hacktivists are the reason the inner circle acknowledged Technomancy as a viable path, which would have been embarrassing, I'm sure. Well, think about it. It was the first time a faction outside of the main clan in the Camarilla had a superior understanding of thaumaturgy. They seek those who are not only potential candidates to study the path, but are also great with tech. Ironically, they are the most like the main clan in its structure and snobbiness, and pretend they embrace all clans into its waves. They do not trust the Malkavians and Gangrel. Naturally, they gravitate towards the Nosferatu the most, which is probably why Violet Ellison approached me. Interesting dilemmas aside, the common paths found here are obviously Path of Technomancy, Path of Blood, Movement of the Mind, Path of Conjuring, Thaumaturgical Countermagic, and the Path of the Levenbolt. I wish to remind you that magic within the Anarch movement is incredibly rare. Mastering any of the paths requires an almost obsessive personality to memorize vast amounts of occult information, an appreciation for subject matters that require determination and patience that the Anarchs just do not have. It is led by the bloody Bruja, after all, many of which just see thaumaturgy as a tool of the enemy. It doesn't help matters that the Anarch Tremere hoard their secrets as much as their Camarilla brethren. And how do the Camarilla view thaumaturgy? With cautious respect. The Tremere were able to use their blood-based magic to curse the new sect's enemies, the Assamites, and nearly obliterate the Tremere anti-tribu. Many princes across the world believe that their blood sorcery is pivotal for the security of the Camarilla, but the fear of the Coldons that freed many of the Anarch fledglings from their blood-bound elders runs deep, and I have no doubt the Tremere know this, taking a smug pride holding this leverage over an entire sect. Many a wise prince knows of blood sorcery's potential, and that if the Tremere are plotting against the Camarilla, which wouldn't surprise me in the slightest, they could overthrow them with ease. That is, of course, presuming that the Sabbat don't pull themselves together and make their moves against their enemy. Not only do they have Tremere and access to thaumaturgy, but the Sabbat have Coldonism, necromancy, and abyss mysticism to destroy the Ivory Tower. It is almost a shame they just do not have the monopoly that the other two sects do, especially so with the Gehenna conflict in the east. But they are not the only potential threats when it comes to an all-out blood sorcery war. I refer to the Duskborn and their experimental thin blood alchemy. As a reminder, it allows the thin-blooded to mimic disciplines, to fly, to awake a vampire deep in torpor, or even to change their own gender. The alchemy has more properties, I'm sure, but those are the only ones I am familiar with. How do they do this? I cannot say, for I lack the data, for most Finn bloods I have encountered do not last very long, if you get my meaning. And that brings me to a worrying conclusion. There is not a lot that we know about blood sorcery, and there is even less that we know about Finn blood alchemy, so I would be very afraid, child, for the strange new magic Cainites of all generations are working on. Very, very afraid indeed. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.